Okay, good morning. Whoa, that's loud. Good morning, everybody. Well done for making it here on a very grim day outside. So, what we are going to move on to today is liability and negligence for omissions. Does this sound really loud to you, or is this okay? Too loud? Good? Yep, okay. Is liability and negligence for omissions in third-party interventions. But what I wanted to do is it's useful just to kind of remind ourselves where we're at, because you've had this one cause of action, negligence, being lectured by both Joe and I. So it's useful just to kind of work out, okay, exactly where we are. What I am going to be doing is I'm still going to be banging on about duty, okay? So the first 4 weeks that Joe took at the beginning of the semester were all about the different elements of a negligence claim. So you need to show that a duty of care is owed, the duty was breached, the breach caused damage or loss, the damage loss was not too remote, and then you look at defences. Now the duty of care question is all about which people, which property, which interests are those to whom the defendant has some potential responsibility for unintentional acts. Okay, it's really a control device to make sure liability doesn't get out of hand. So Joe discussed those 4 questions first, then I came in and for 3 weeks we looked at the question of when will the defendant owe the claimant a duty of care not to cause them economic loss. Okay, so we looked at our interest in avoiding economic loss. And we talked about why economic loss is and should be treated differently to interests like bodily integrity and property. And the reason is because it's usually caused in the process of not damaging something we have, but something we desire to acquire. We started with negligent misstatement that causes pure economic loss, and to show a duty of care there, you need to show an assumption of responsibility. And then we moved to relational economic loss, and the position there is a bit less clear. We've got different approaches being taken by different jurisdictions. But the most perhaps the most principled approach seems to be a broad exclusionary approach subject to certain defined exceptions that has been well articulated in Canada. And then we looked at what we called sui generis kinds of pure economic loss. And the position in New Zealand is much more fluid here, particularly compared to the UK, where assumption of responsibility is pretty much always required before a duty of care will be owed in relation to economic loss. Whereas in New Zealand, we've seen that policy really drives the court to find, in its inquiry as to whether a duty of care should be owed, and that's particularly so in that defective building context. Now after that, Joe then looked at the duty question in the context of pure mental injury. The courts have been nervous about mental injury for different reasons, which Joe would have covered, and there can be different damage hurdles and different proximity hurdles imposed in different jurisdictions before a duty of care will be recognised. So what I'm now going to cover is omissions, and the question is, when will the court impose a duty of care to confer a benefit on the plaintiff? Okay, so the way we're going to go through it, we're going to remind ourselves about the idea of a duty of care, and I know I bang on about this so much, but I do this because when I mark exams, I find that these things are talked about without the context of why they're being talked about, okay? That there is no identification, that the reason why someone is focusing on, for example, assumption of responsibility is because that is what is required to show a duty of care. So we're going to remind ourselves about the broad duty of care inquiry. Then we're going to identify why the law is reluctant to impose a duty to act, although actually what we're going to do first is identify the difference between acts and omissions, and then we'll look at why the law is reluctant, and we'll look at a case. And then we're going to identify the broad picture of liability, okay, the pattern that we can look at that we can use to ascertain whether a duty of care will be owed for an omission. And what we will see with this broad picture of liability is that we are not normally liable for a danger we have not created unless special circumstances exist. We will identify what those special circumstances are, and we will look at a number of case examples where those special circumstances come up. But we are likely liable for a danger we have created, including a danger resulting from human agency, where it is foreseeable that third parties may spark it off. And again, we're going to look at case examples that demonstrate this broad rule. And then I'll have a new set of slides to look at the liability of public bodies, and we'll see how these ideas play out in that context. So just a reminder about the duty inquiry. Sometimes it is an established duty relationship, okay? So you might have a driver and a passenger, like Nettleship and Western. It might be a lawyer and a client, teacher, pupil, doctor, patient. When there are these established duty situations, you generally just cite the case. You don't need to go down the novel duty of care inquiry process. But when you move to a novel situation, the New Zealand approach is set out in cases like the Grange and South Pacific, and it involves a two-part inquiry. The first is the internal inquiry. We have the foreseeability of harm screen, and then there is a relationship, then the question of is there a relationship of sufficient proximity between the claimant and defendant, such that in the reasonable contemplation of the defendant, carelessness on its part may be likely to cause damage to the plaintiff. So when we are in these situations like omissions and we have these special circumstances, which we will go into, are each examples of where the courts consider there is adequate proximity to justify a duty of care. We then have the external questions, which looks at any considerations of policy that are relevant to the recognition or otherwise of a duty of care. And I've just put some dicta on these slides so that it's easily accessible to you from the Grange, because I think it's actually really helpful dicta, okay? And so it's Justice Blanchard in the Grange, where he talked about first foreseeability in novel cases being a screening mechanism. Foreseeability is the inquiry that excludes claims that must obviously fail because no reasonable person in the shoes of the defendant would have foreseen the loss. And the law would then regard that unforeseeable loss as such an unlikely result of the plaintiff's act or omission that it would not be fair to impose liability, even if that act or omission were a cause or even the sole cause of the loss. If you can't foresee it, you can't take action to avoid it. Now, once you've established foreseeability, you then move to that more difficult question of whether the foreseeable loss occurred within a relationship that was sufficiently proximate. So this concept of proximity is notoriously elusive. I have some students come up to me in the past and say it feels like proximity is virtually meaningless. And it is almost an umbrella term that captures different kinds of relationship, okay? And we're going to look at that in the context of omissions. But it requires the court to consider the closeness of the connection between the parties. It's a means of identifying whether the defendant was someone most appropriately placed to take care in the avoidance of damage to the plaintiff. And he then moves on to the external questions, okay? So you go through foreseeability, proximity, and then you get to external questions. And in a small number of cases, the court will find no duty of care exists, notwithstanding that the loss was foreseeable and the relationship sufficiently proximate. Do so because a factor or factors external to that relationship would make it not fair, just and reasonable to impose the claimed duty of care on the defendant. So this is when the court looks beyond the parties and assesses the wider effects of the decision on society and on the law generally. Issues such as the capacity of each party to insure against liability, the likely behaviour of other potential defendants, and consistency of imposition of liability within the legal system may arise. So, we know that different jurisdictions take different approaches to the duty question, to novel duty questions. Now, the UK has moved away from any idea that there is some kind of test and says that the law develops incrementally, by analogy, with established authority. New Zealand likes to stick to this kind of framework of at least having internal and external inquiries, but analogies are always going to be relevant to whether a duty of care should be recognised in a novel situation. And we had when I was last lecturing, we spoke about some of Justice Mellon's dicta in Strathboss to that effect. Okay, analogies are always relevant. And to draw an analogy, you need to identify the legally significant features involved in a situation. Okay, you need to look at the legally significant features covered by previous authorities where a duty was recognised and consider how far have these taken the law, what similarities exist in this novel situation, and how much further are you asking the law to develop. We saw a really good example of that kind of reasoning in Lord Brown Wilkinson's judgment in White and Jones. Right, so bearing in mind the importance of legally significant features, what we're now going to look at is omissions. So private law is much more ready to impose a duty on persons not to cause physical harm by their positive acts than it will impose duties of care for a failure to act, which is also known as an omission. Now, the reasons for this is something we've talked about right at the beginning, okay? Part of it is freedom. As soon as the law starts saying you had a duty to do this thing, to confer this benefit on this person, it's infringing on our freedom in a significant way. Instead of just saying, don't damage, you can do anything you like, provided you don't damage someone's personal property by your positive acts, that gives you huge scope to act with autonomy. It's saying, no, you have to do this one thing, okay? So that ability to act with autonomy has been vastly reduced as soon as the law imposes a duty of care to take action. And the law is very reluctant to do this. So as a result, there is a general rule that we are not liable for our omissions. But it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between an act and an omission. So an act is doing something to the plaintiff. An omission is failing to confer a benefit on the plaintiff. Sometimes you think, well, actually, many things can be reframed as an omission if we really want to do this, okay? So you could say that you're driving your car and you cause a car crash by omitting to use the brakes, okay? And you're like, well, is that an act or is that an omission? But the better language and the clearer conceptual difference is to focus on the difference between wrongfully doing something to the plaintiff, i.e. crashing into them, as compared to failing to confer a benefit on the plaintiff. So in an act case, the defendant makes the claimant worse off by doing something positive. So the claimant is worse off than they would have been if the defendant had done nothing at all. Okay, so that's how we tell if we're dealing with an act. Is the claimant worse off than they would have been if the defendant had done nothing at all? In an omission case, the claimant is no worse off than they would have been had the defendant done nothing at all, but the defendant has failed to confer a benefit on the claimant. So, to kind of illustrate this difference between an act and an omission, let's consider this example. The road authorities put up a sign on a dangerous road that says, "Caution, hairpin turn." Now, they fail to affix the sign properly, and as a result, the sign blows over. Now, first scenario, it blows into the bush, and in this blue car, John is driving along, unaware of the hairpin turn ahead. He careers off the road and damages his car. If he wants to claim against the party who put the sign on the road but failed to affix it properly, is he claiming for an act or an omission? Did I hear someone say omission? No? So, is he, okay, another way of asking this question, is John worse off in this situation than if the road authorities had done nothing at all? Yes, exactly. So what does that make this? Yeah. Sorry, I can't see who's speaking. Can you put your hand up? Oh, yeah. Right, thank you. Yes, it is an omission. So it blows into the bush and he drives along in the dark unaware. Now, in the second picture we have here, the sign is poorly affixed and it blows onto the road and he's driving along and suddenly a massive sign comes and blows in front of his car and causes him to career off the road and damage his car. Is this an act or omission? So again, a useful question is John worse off than if the road authorities had done nothing at all? If the road authorities had done nothing at all, would there be a sign that could blow onto the road and damage his car? No, I'm seeing people shake their head. Thank you. So does that mean it's an act or an omission? Act. Yep. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just hearing voices. I can't quite identify who is saying them. Right. Okay. So you can see that sometimes identifying the difference, you need to think about the difference. It's the first thing you need to do is look at the problem you're dealing with and say, is this an act or is this an omission? And a very good question to ask in identifying whether this is an act or an omission is the plaintiff worse off than they would have been if the defendant had done nothing at all? Alternatively, another useful question to ask, if you feel like that's not quite giving you the right answer, is has the defendant done something to the plaintiff, in which case it's an act, or have they failed to confer a benefit on the plaintiff? Is that the complaint? What is the claimant complaining about? That the defendant has done something to them, or that they have failed to confer a benefit on them? Now, it's much more difficult to show that a defendant has a duty of care to confer a benefit on a claimant, but it is not impossible. So we have a general rule that we are not liable for our omissions. We don't owe duties of care to others to do things. We don't owe duties of care for our omissions. But there are exceptions, and we are going to go through those exceptions. The first case I want to talk about, though, is one that illustrates the general rule, that there is no liability for omissions. So it's a case called Sud Tredha in National Environment Research Centre. And it involved the Bangladeshi government. They had sought to provide drinking water for their citizens by sinking millions of tube wells all over the country to access underground water supplies. Now, unfortunately, in many of the locations where these tube wells were sunk, the water was actually contaminated with arsenic, or the area around it was contaminated with arsenic, and that then contaminated the water. And they estimated that tens of millions of Bangladeshis have suffered arsenic poisoning as a result of these tube wells. And the claimant, Sud Tredha, was one of them. Now, the defendants, the National Environment Research Centre, were an organisation who were doing a study on how well these tube wells were standing up to the strain of repeated use. Now, at the time that they were doing this study into the tube wells, there had been no suggestion that the water was contaminated. Now, as part of the study, they did look into the chemistry of the water purely for the purpose of seeing whether or not this water could also support fish farms. But they didn't test for arsenic. So they did look into the chemistry of it, but as part of that testing, they didn't test for arsenic. Now, had they done so, they would have spotted the contamination and something would have been done about it. But they didn't. So the claimant sued in negligence, arguing that they had owed him a duty of care in carrying out the study. But it was dismissed by the House of Lords as hopeless. The reason this was dismissed as hopeless was because the defendants had not done anything to make the claimants worse off. They had merely failed to do something that would have saved the claimant from getting ill. Okay, the tube wells existed, people were drinking from them, they just wanted to know whether the water, how well the tube wells were standing up and whether they could use it for fish farms. This was entirely unrelated. And there was no duty of care here, okay? This was a pure omission to do something, to do an extra test, to test for arsenic. And there were no special circumstances attaching to this case that made it fair, just and reasonable to find that a duty of care would be owed. It was a clear case of an omission where they had merely failed to do something that would have benefited the claimant. So that's the general rule. That's a case that you can use in support of the general rule. Our real focus is going to be on what the exceptions to the general rule are. We're going to look at when will the law decide that there are special circumstances that justify a duty of care being owed. And we're going to focus on what the legally significant features are of these cases where courts have imposed a duty of care for failing to provide a benefit. before we look at it, I just want us to think about what actually justifies this general rule of no liability for omissions. Now, this is a really useful piece of dicta from Lord Hoffman in Stoven and Wise, okay? And he looks at 3 broad reasons that justify the general rule of no liability for omissions. Now, the first bit's not on here, but I'm just going to read it out. He says, there are sound reasons why omissions require different treatment from positive conduct. It is one thing for the law to say that a person who undertakes some activity shall take reasonable care not to cause damage to others. It is another thing for the law to require that a person who is doing nothing in particular shall take steps to prevent others from suffering harm from the acts of third parties or natural causes. And he says you can put the matter in political, moral, or economic terms, okay? And then this is what this quote deals with. In political terms, he says, it is less of an invasion of an individual's freedom for the law to require him to consider the safety of others in his actions than to impose upon him a duty to rescue or protect. Okay, so that's this freedom argument. The political argument is the one about freedom. A moral version that justifies this general rule of no liability for omissions, he refers to as the why pick on me argument. A duty to prevent harm to others or to render assistance to a person in danger or distress may apply to a large and indeterminate class of people who happen to be able to do something. Why should one of those persons be held liable rather than another? And then in economic terms, the efficient allocation of resources usually requires an activity should bear its own costs. If it benefits from being able to impose some of its costs on other people, what economists call externalities, the market is distorted because the activity appears cheaper than it really is. So liability to pay compensation for loss caused by negligent conduct acts as a deterrent against increasing the cost of the activity to the community and reduces externalities. But there is no similar justification for requiring a person who is not doing anything to spend money on behalf of someone else. And we can look at that, these 3 reasons, the political, the moral, and the economic. We can apply it to the parable of the Good Samaritan. This parable may appear slightly random, but it appears in the case law. Okay, they often refer to the parable of the Good Samaritan when looking at cases of omission. So what is the parable? A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn and took care of him, etc. Okay. Tort law does not require us to be a good Samaritan. Okay, that's the critical thing. We don't have to rescue people. We can walk on by. There is no duty to rescue in the common law. We have no duty to take positive actions to intervene into other people's lives to make them better. It's more focused on making sure that we don't harm others by our positive actions than when we omit to act when we could have taken action and improved the lives of others. It can be confusing when you talk about omissions as a failure to act, or a duty to take care in relation to an omission is often a duty to act. but you've just got to be clear that you're looking at positive conduct versus failure to confer a benefit. Okay, so if we were to apply Lord Hoffman's dicta to this Good Samaritan parable, the political argument would say you cannot tell the priest or the Levite where to walk and what to do, provided they are not harming anyone by their positive acts. And if you do tell them what they have to do, then you are interfering with their freedom. The moral argument would say, well, why are you picking on the priest and the Levite in this? What about John and Matthew and Luke and Hannah and Mary, who also walked on by and didn't step in to save the man who had been attacked by robbers? Do they all owe a duty to the man in the street? Why just pick on one of them? And the economic analysis is probably more a case of saying that, well, the priest and the Levite can decide where and how to spend their money and time. Now, maybe if the injured person wants to pay them to look after him, they can decide whether they want to do that. But the law is economically inefficient if it imposes a duty to act in circumstances where it's essentially not the most economically efficient thing to do. So, general rule, no liability for pure omissions. We can walk past the injured and the suffering. Tort law lets us go to hell in our own way. That's what sometimes said. But there are exceptions, okay. So let's have a look at the broad picture. When will the law say, actually, you know what, that moral argument, that political argument, that economic argument, not good enough here. We're actually going to impose a duty to act. The first thing is that in these situations, they are not cases of pure omission. The defendant has not done nothing at all, but they're viewed in the context of wider conduct, okay? The defendant has voluntarily behaved in some way, and the omission, in which the law is saying, actually, here you have a duty to act, this is viewed in the context of this wider positive conduct. Okay, so because of what the defendant has voluntarily done, the concerns that imposing liability to do something might interfere with that defendant's autonomy in a way that is unacceptable, these concerns kind of fall away, and the courts impose a duty of care. So, we're not normally liable for a danger we have not created unless special circumstances exist. What are these special circumstances? Number one, the defendant has assumed responsibility by taking on a task for the claimant's welfare. Number two, the defendant's status is holding a position of responsibility. So this might be a landowner or an employer, or it might be kind of a relationship of like a parent or someone in a parental role. And the third special circumstance is when the defendant is in a position of control over the cause of the danger. Now, this usually involves liability for acts of a third party, but it's not necessarily limited to that. And there is reasonable foreseeability of harm caused by that danger, and there is a particular risk of harm to the particular plaintiff. Okay, so that's the rule around dangers we have not created. We are, however, likely liable for a danger we have created, including a danger resulting from human agency, or what's sometimes called third-party intervention, where it is foreseeable that third parties may spark off that danger. So these here essentially describe in broad terms the legally significant features of cases where the courts will say this relationship between the defendant and the claimant was proximate enough. There were these special circumstances that mean it is appropriate to impose a duty of care for an omission. It is appropriate to impose a duty of care on the defendant to take care to confer a benefit on the plaintiff. So we might have, before we start with our first special circumstance, let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back at 9:45. Yeah. Sorry, I'll just... That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say it's relevant in terms of that is the first case that said we owe duties to our neighbours not to cause them physical harm by our positive conduct. So if you ever had a case, you know, involving, I mean, obviously the manufacture of something that caused bodily injury, that's the case you apply to. But it also kind of is the case that got around this whole idea of retraction of privacy. But it's about the general, like Jonathan Stevenson is the kind of massive easy, this is a straightforward case of positive conduct causing physical harm. And then we have, you know, reasons why we don't just apply that rule to when it's economic harm as opposed to physical harm, or when it's an omission rather than physical conduct. So, I mean, what I would say is in the exceptions we're about to go through, it's not a case where there has been, like there is some kind of positive conduct on behalf of the defendant that justifies a duty of care for failure to confer a benefit. That a pure, I mean, and so like I wouldn't get too caught up in pure omission versus that. It's more the difference between this is a case where one of these special circumstances apply. That would be, for instance, in that good Samaritan parable, if we're all just walk, you know, pure omission, we'll just walk past the person going. But maybe if I'm the employer of that person and it's a workplace, maybe I don't get caught up. Maybe my role means I actually get a duty to step on and do something.
So there's something more.
There's something more. That's exactly right. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. So the exceptions would be more correct to say that the exceptions come under the underlying convention of
Yeah, I think that's right. Or, I mean, yeah, how could you say? You could say that. So we generally have no liability for our omissions, but sometimes a special circumstance will apply in which the case the courts will recognise a duty to attention. So, yeah, I probably wouldn't get caught up in the difference between omission and pure omission. I would look at, this is an omission, does a special circumstance apply? get caught up when thinking about contributory negligence. And, okay, I think the negligence is beyond what we know. Yeah. Bit of a cop out, but sometimes also you don't have to driving cars and things like that. You don't then break it down into different things you do. You don't find the turn your impact. Is that your omission? It's like actually what you fail to do.
Yeah, still failing to conform to the same
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
And he contributed to that part.
Yeah, as a driving instructor, holding back and providing driving instruction, you know, he failed to, he contributed to the damage by not doing it, but he is doing positively driving instruction. Okay, so first special circumstance in which a court will recognise that a defendant has a duty of care to confer a benefit on a claimant when there is an assumption of responsibility. Okay, so when the defendant has assumed responsibility by taking on a task for the claimant. Now, we're going to go through cases that illustrate this, but we're first going to look at two questions. Question one, why does assumption of responsibility make a difference? It makes a difference because if the objection to imposing duties to confer benefits on others is kind of justified because they interfere with our freedom, that objection has a clear answer when the defendant has voluntarily taken on a task for the claimant. The duty bearer has essentially chosen to take on a responsibility in relation to the plaintiff's well-being. Okay, they have undertaken to do something. They have voluntarily undertaken to do a task for the plaintiff. So because they voluntarily chose to do that, this objection that, well, hold on, you're interfering with their freedom, that falls away because they chose to do something and then the duty of care was imposed when they did it. The next question is, what does assumption of responsibility mean in this context? Okay, it essentially means that, do I have a, no, okay. It means A takes on a task for B in circumstances in which it is plausible to imply an undertaking to exercise due care in the performance of that task. Okay, I'll just repeat that. Assumption of responsibility here means A takes on a task for B in circumstances in which it is plausible to imply an undertaking to exercise due care in the performance of that task. It differs from the assumption of responsibility we have talked about in negligent misstatements causing pure economic loss. Reasonable reliance is not necessarily part of it in the case of omissions. Okay, you can assume responsibility and have a legal duty to take care of an unconscious person. Okay, an unconscious person can't actively rely on you. You can assume responsibility and have a duty to take care of a child who may not consciously rely on you. So reliance, sometimes we'll see reliance does appear to be material to the recognition of a duty of care. Sometimes it's not relevant at all. The picture's not black and white, it's not entirely clear. And you really need to go with analogical reasoning. You know, what is similar to this case compared to that other case where a duty was or was not recognised, was reliance required there? Right. So, assumption of responsibility, A takes on a task for B in circumstances where it is plausible to imply an undertaking to exercise due care in the performance of that task. Professional relationships involve assumptions of responsibility to provide some kind of professional service, and the law imposes a duty of care in that context. So that explains, doctor-patient, lawyer-client. These are established relationships where duties are owed by the professional to the client to take care and conferring the benefit of advice, whether it be legal advice, medical advice, etc. But we're going to look at some cases that are closer to the boundary line. Okay, so we're going to go through Barnett and Chelsea and Kensington, Barrett and Ministry of Defence, Kent and Griffiths, and Stansby and Troman. And I think it's useful in each case just to think, how has responsibility been assumed here? What made it plausible to impose a duty of care to confer the benefit? The first case I don't actually have a slide for. Barnett and Chelsea and Kensington. So you may have covered this case already with Joe. Have you covered this case? Anyone nod or shake their head? Oh, yep, thumbs up, thank you. So 3 night watchmen had been drinking tea at 5 a.m. and they spent the next 3 hours vomiting and suffering from abdominal pain. Okay, they went to the casualty department of the nearest hospital. Now, the nurse was a bit dubious. It was actually New Year's Eve. Well, the night before had been New Year's Eve, and she thought they had been drinking to excess. And nevertheless, though, she took their complaint and she passed on their symptoms to the duty medical officer by telephone. So he received her call and replied, "Well, I'm vomiting myself, and I have not been drinking. Tell them to go home, go to bed, and call in their own doctors in the morning." So they left, and they went home and went to bed, and later that morning one of the men died. Now, it transpired that the tea had been contaminated by arsenic. There seems to be a lot of arsenic in these emissions cases. Now, his widow then sued the hospital for negligence. Okay, now what you've probably considered this case, probably in the context of causation. But we're looking at it in terms of duty. So the key question from our perspective is, what is the duty of those who provide and run a casualty department when a person presents himself at that casualty department complaining of illness or injury before he is treated and taken into the hospital ward? So before you have that established doctor-patient relationship, when you just turn up and you say, "I'm suffering from this injury," what is the duty of the casualty department? Do they have a duty to see and examine the person? Now, in reaching their answer in this case, the court noted that this was not a case of a casualty department which had closed its doors and said no patients can be received. If it had been that sort of case, there would be no assumption of responsibility. But in this case, the 3 men entered, 3 night watchmen, entered the defendant's hospital without hindrance. And they made complaints about their symptoms to the duty nurse. She received those complaints and she passed those complaints on to the duty medical officer. And then he sent back a message through the nurse purporting to advise the 3 men. So on these facts, is there a proximate relationship between the 3 men and the hospital staff that gives rise to a duty of care to take action, a duty of care to see and examine the men? And the court found, yes, there was a duty of care here, okay? The casualty department did owe a duty of care to see and examine the three men. What made it plausible to imply the duty of care here? Well, it was a public hospital, okay? It was open to the world for medical treatment. The nurse had received their complaints, she'd passed them on, and he considered them and told them to go home. This made it an assumption of responsibility in which it was plausible to imply on behalf of the casualty department a duty of care to see and examine the patients. Now, they noted that there might be exceptions to this. There might be exceptions where a casualty department would not owe a duty of care to patients who turned up seeking medical treatment. Examples that they gave included if the patient was misusing the casualty department. Okay, so an example of misuse would be coming in for a second opinion from their own doctor. Okay, that's not what a casualty department is for. A casualty department is for kind of more emergency situations. You can't use it to get second opinions. Or if the patient came in for a minor cut which a nurse could dress without needing to bother a doctor. Here, the doctor wouldn't have a duty of care to see and examine the person. Again, that's not what the casualty department is for. But otherwise, when the doors of the casualty department are open to the world, the nurse has a duty to take the history of the patient, and she had done that. She had met her duty of care. She then passed it on to the doctor, and the doctor then had a duty to see and examine the patients, okay? The omission to examine, his failure to come down and actually see the three men, was a breach of the duty of care. But as you all know, there was no liability in this case. The reason, so remember, duty is just the first question. We have duty, breach, causation, and damage. Here, it was shown that even if they had been examined, this man had been examined, he would still have died. He could not prove to the balance of probabilities that reasonable medical care would have saved his life. So the kind of arsenic poisoning was so severe, reasonable medical care could not have prevented the death. Right, so that is Barnet and Chelsea and Kensington. Now the next case we're going to look at is Barrett and the Ministry of Defence. Now this time it did involve alcohol rather than tea. So Barrett was a naval airman based on a remote base in Norway. The main off-duty activity in this remote naval base was drinking. So on the night in question, it was a Friday night, it was his birthday, it was Barrett's birthday, and Barrett had just received a promotion. There were 2 bars at the base in which the drinks were, according to the judge, astonishingly cheap. There were naval regulations about drinking that were ignored and not enforced. Mr. Barrett drank an extraordinary amount. He bought some of the drinks, others were bought for him to celebrate his birthday and his promotion, etc. He then became unconscious and he comed out on a chair. A senior officer saw him and ordered that he be taken to his cabin. So a stretcher was arranged and he was placed on his bunk in the recovery position. And he was visited on 3 occasions, checked on. Now, when his cabin mate went to turn in at 2:30 a.m. in the morning, Mr. Barrett was found dead, and he had asphyxiated on his own vomit. So the deceased's widow then claimed damages from the Ministry of Defence for breach of a duty of care that she alleged they owed her husband. So there were two questions that the court considered. The first question was, did the Ministry of Defence owe a duty of care to Mr. Barrett to prevent him from abusing alcohol, to prevent him from drinking as much as he did and becoming unconscious through alcohol abuse? So I'm just going to read out a bit from Lord Justice Beldam. The key part I've put on this slide. But essentially the answer to this question was no. There was no duty of care owed for this part, okay? Lord Justice Beldam said the plaintiff argued for a duty of care for the safety of the deceased from analogous categories. It basically tried to get an extension of a duty of care from analogous categories in which there is an obligation to use reasonable care. So you've got employer, employee, pupil, schoolmaster, occupier of land, visitor to land. And she argued that the defendant's control over the environment, their control over the naval base in which the deceased was serving, and the provision of the duty-free liquor, coupled with the failure to enforce the disciplinary rules and orders, were sufficient factors, she tried to argue, to make it fair, just and reasonable to extend the duty to take reasonable care found in what she asserted were analogous circumstances. The characteristic which distinguishes those relationships is reliance expressed or implied in the relationship which the party to whom the duty is owed is entitled to place on the other party to make provision for his safety. But the judge said, I can see no reason why it should not be fair, just and reasonable for the law to leave a responsible adult to assume responsibility for his own actions in consuming alcoholic drink. No one is better placed to judge the amount that he can safely consume or to exercise control in his own interest as well as in the interest of others. To dilute self-responsibility and to blame one adult for another's lack of self-control is neither just nor reasonable, and in the development of the law of negligence an increment too far. Okay, so the court said, we are not going to recognise a duty of care on behalf of the Ministry of Defence to prevent Mr. Barrett becoming unconscious through alcohol abuse. He is an adult, he can take some self-responsibility, and he is alone responsible for how much he drinks. Now, they did compare it to other cases where a duty had been found. I actually think this is quite a good, if you read this case, it's on the reading list. It's useful in terms of seeing analogical reasoning, and they look at what was different about these cases where a duty had been found compared to the case that they were dealing with here in Barrett. Now, one case involved a defendant who sold the plaintiff alcohol to the point of intoxication, then provided him with ski gear for a dangerous downhill ski race in which the plaintiff became injured. Okay, and the other involved a plaintiff who was the habitual customer of the defendant who ran some kind of pub, and he became intoxicated, and then the publican evicted him, knowing he was completely incapable and he would have to cross a busy thoroughfare, which he did and was injured in doing so. Now, in both these cases, the imposition of a duty was based on factors additional to the mere provision of alcohol. Okay, this wasn't a duty, you've got to stop this person becoming drunk. It was something additional to the failure to strictly enforce provisions kind of against drunkenness. In both these cases, the defendant not only provided the alcohol, but then they did something additional, an additional positive act, which exposed the defendant to physical danger. And it was that on which the duty was based. Okay, in one case, they supplied him with a whole lot of alcohol and then said, hey, here's a downhill ski race and here are some skis, get to it. On the other case, they supplied him with a whole lot of alcohol and then evicted him knowing he had to cross a busy road. Okay, so it's this additional positive act that was the act on which the duty of care was based. And so you could see these as cases of creating the danger, which, you know, we are likely liable for a danger we have created. The second point here, which we will get to these cases. So the court that we're considering this claim brought by Barrett's widow against the Ministry of Defence, they considered these other cases involving alcohol abuse and they distinguished them. And they distinguished them because they involved an additional positive act. So they said there is no duty of care on behalf of the Ministry of Defence to prevent him from abusing alcohol. But the second question, did the Ministry of Defence owe a duty to take care of Mr. Barrett after he had collapsed and they had assumed responsibility by taking him to his bunk? And the answer here was yes. Okay, after the defendant assumed responsibility for Mr. Barrett on his collapse, the measures taken fell short of the standard reasonably expected. They did not summon medical assistance, and their supervision was inadequate. And it seems the duty arose at the moment the senior officer ordered that he be taken to his cabin. This was the assumption of responsibility to take care of him. Okay, it is that assumption of responsibility that founded the duty, and they breached that duty when they failed to, get medical assistance and adequately supervise him. But the damages were reduced by 2/3 for his own contributory negligence. Mr. Barrett's lack of self-control in his own interest caused the defendant to have to assume responsibility. So the damages sought were reduced by 2/3 to take account of this. Now, this case can raise a bit of a conundrum if you look at it you can start to think, well, what if they hadn't assumed responsibility? What if they hadn't taken him to his cabin and just left him comatose on the chair and he had died? Would they have been liable then? Did they owe a duty to intervene, or just a duty to take reasonable care after they had intervened? The case's only authority for the point that once responsibility had been assumed to help him, they had a duty to take reasonable care in providing that kind of help and assistance. There were guidance notes in the instruction manual for operating the base that said if men were unfit for duty because of alcohol, they should have the man examined by the duty medical officer. They should make sure he does not lie on his back to avoid suffocation, and they should make sure he is sighted every few minutes. Okay, so that's something particular about this case, that there were guidance notes as to how they should deal with the situation, and they did not comply with those guidance notes. They didn't get the medical assistance. They didn't sight him every few minutes. Because it's a situation of employment, so this was a naval base, it's likely that the commanding officer would have been bound to assume responsibility for him in accordance with the principle that employers owe a duty to take reasonable care of employees who are taken sick or injured at work. Okay, so they probably had a duty to intervene. They couldn't have just left him, and to take reasonable care in doing so. But outside an employment relationship, I wonder if there would be a duty of care here. You know, there is a risk that if you impose duties of care on Good Samaritans, people who try and help, or in rescuers performing a rescue, you put them off. You know, would they have been better off to leave him where he was? So if a group of flatmates go out and they bring home their flatmate who has drunk too much and put him to bed and don't monitor him, and they then choke on their own vomit, I don't know if there's going to be liability and negligence there. I think the fact that this was an employment relationship was probably quite significant. Actually, the absence of a duty to rescue is one of the most contentious things in the common law. In the US, there's this concern, you know, it's kind of a more litigious society, and the concern of liability attaching to a failed attempt to rescue, the concern that this liability might put off people who would otherwise step in to help others has led to these Good Samaritan statutes, which recognise an immunity from suit, at least in some cases, and the same thing exists in Australia. Civil jurisdictions, so not common law jurisdictions, but civil jurisdictions often do impose duties of easy rescue. So if you don't do an easy rescue, you can be liable. So it's a really interesting big picture question. Should there be a duty to rescue? Should there be a duty to easy rescue? Equally, if you do step in and do a rescue, should there be any liability if you don't do it well enough? It's an interesting question. But in this case, I think the fact that it was an employment relationship, that was material. I think if you had a problem that didn't involve an employment relationship, I don't know if you'd get the same outcome. Does anyone have any questions about that case? So the next case we're going to look at is Kent and Griffiths and the London Ambulance Service. So these are all examples of when there has been an assumption of responsibility by taking on a task, and the defendant has then owed a duty to take reasonable care in the carrying out of that task. So in this case, the claimant had an asthma attack, and the doctor attended her at home and called for an ambulance to take her immediately to hospital. Time was of the essence. Okay, now the ambulance didn't arrive, and the doctor followed up, called twice more, and each time they were told, oh, it's just a few minutes away, it's just a few minutes away. The ambulance didn't arrive until 40 minutes after the phone call, and it was only a distance of 6 miles to the claimant's home. Once the claimant was in the ambulance, she suffered a respiratory arrest, and this resulted in her suffering brain damage. Now, the evidence revealed the ambulance could and should have arrived at her house at least 14 minutes earlier, and if it had, there was a high chance that respiratory arrest and brain damage would have been avoided. Now, it later transpired also that the ambulance service then falsified their records as to when they'd arrived. Like, there was no reason, there was just no reason for the ambulance to have delayed its arrival. They basically were just slack in leaving the base. So an important feature of this case, which we're going to come back to when we look directly at public body liability, is that there was no question of an ambulance not being available. Okay, the ambulance, and there was no question that there was a conflict in priorities of where the ambulance needed to go. They didn't have 15 calls and had to work out where they were going to send the 3 ambulances. Okay, there was an ambulance there, it wasn't being used, there were no other calls, there was no reason it shouldn't have got there faster than it did. Now, in this case, the question was, does an ambulance service owe a duty of care to a member of the public on whose behalf an emergency phone call is made if, due to carelessness, it fails to arrive within a reasonable time. And it was held that the acceptance of the call established the duty of care to arrive in the reasonable time. Now, how was responsibility assumed here? This is an assumption of responsibility case. It was assumed when the call was accepted. Okay, when they said, yes, an ambulance is on its way. They've assumed responsibility then for the ambulance to get there within a reasonable time. At this point, proximity was created because it was accepted that sending an ambulance out benefited Mrs. Kent. Okay, it was just to benefit her. And it was reasonably foreseeable that if it wasn't dispatched, if that ambulance wasn't immediately dispatched, physical harm would be suffered by Mrs. Kent. When an ambulance service says an ambulance is on its way, those who are waiting for that ambulance abandon any attempt to find alternative means of transport to the hospital. Okay, if they said, sorry, we don't have any ambulances, they'd have looked for alternative means. Maybe they'd have driven her there themselves. Okay, but when you're told an ambulance is on its way, you think, okay, this is under control. We will wait until the ambulance arrives. Now, like I say, we're going to come back to this case when we move on to public bodies, but it's really important. One of the reasons that justify a duty of care by a public body, the ambulance service, to Mrs. Kent, was that it was just going to benefit Mrs. Kent. When that's how ambulance services work. And it was entirely foreseeable that if it wasn't dispatched, physical harm would be suffered. It has often been explained, this case, on the basis of misleading assurances being given when there was a reasonable and foreseeable risk of physical injury being suffered. So they were told it would be dispatched straight away. When it hadn't arrived within a reasonable time, they were told it would be there within a few minutes. And when it hadn't arrived within a few minutes, they were told it would just be a few more minutes away. When it hadn't arrived within that few minutes, they were told, oh, it'll just be a few more minutes. You know, there were just multiple occasions of misleading assurances given. And in addition, there was reliance on these assurances, okay? The doctor said in the evidence that had she known the ambulance was not going to arrive promptly, if they'd said, actually, this ambulance is 40 minutes away, she would have advised the claimant's hospital to drive, the claimant's husband to drive her to the hospital himself. Now, I briefly mentioned the role of reliance in an assumption of responsibility. We know that in a negligent misstatement causing pure economic loss, reliance is key, okay? In cases of omissions not involving pure economic loss, reliance sometimes is and sometimes is not required. This is a case where reliance seemed to be quite relevant, okay? Now, this might feel a bit unsatisfactory, a bit uncertain. Everyone likes black and white rules. Negligence is nothing if not massively murky, okay? But all you need to do is identify it. Is there reliance? And if there isn't, is that going to be problematic in this case or not? You know, that's the kind of thing that you're looking at. That's what you're looking at. How is the case you're dealing with similar or not to a case like this where reliance seemed to be quite important? If reliance is not there in an assumption of responsibility for an omission, that may not be fatal to a claim. In Barrett, there was no reliance. Why? Because Barrett was unconscious. He couldn't rely. Right, so let's come back at 10:24 and we'll carry on. Let's have another 5-minute break. Okay. Right, so we're looking at special circumstance one of when someone may be liable for an omission, and this is when there has been an assumption of responsibility in relation to a task. Barnett involved recognition of a duty of care to see and examine patients when an entity has assumed responsibility through being a hospital open to the public. Barrett, duty of care was owed to take reasonable steps to look after a comatose employee once there'd been an assumption of responsibility by removing them from the bar and taking them to their room. And Kent involved a duty of care being owed to a member of the public by an ambulance service when the call had been accepted to arrive within a reasonable time. So this case here, this final case, Stansby and Troman, involves a third party as well, and the defendant reveals how a defendant can be liable for the act of a third party if they've assumed responsibility to look after another's property. So it's quite a simple case. It was a decorator was left at home alone in a house. He was wallpapering the house and he was left alone. The owner said, "I'm leaving to go out," and so he knew he was alone in the house. And he then left himself to obtain wallpaper. And he didn't lock the door when he left. And during his absence, a thief entered the home and stole various items of property, including a diamond bracelet. And the owners of this house then claimed the loss of the property that had been stolen from the decorator. And the question then was, well, did this decorator owe a duty of care to the householder to secure the premises if he left them during the performance of his work? And it was held that, yes, he did. The contractual relationship that existed between the decorator and the householder was such that he was found to have assumed responsibility to leave the premises in a secure state. Now, this contractual relationship didn't need to expressly state that he would lock up when he left. That was implied into the relationship between them, where he would be left alone in the house to decorate. Okay, so he was liable for the theft. The reason for imposing the duty was to guard against the very thing that happened, which is that if you leave a house unlocked, thieves might enter and steal things. Okay, so that's the first special circumstance when liability will be imposed for an omission, and that is when the defendant has assumed responsibility to do a task for the benefit of the claimant. The next special circumstance is when the defendant is in a position of responsibility, or when they have a special status. So it's kind of another kind of assumption of responsibility. These ideas can all start to morph into one another. The person the defendant in this case, voluntarily accepts a specific role, okay, or they enter into a specific relationship with another person, which carries with it recognised responsibilities to protect the other person's welfare. So, examples include an owner or occupier of land, bailees, employer-employee relationships, child carers. This is just to give you a kind of broad idea of the situations where this might apply. In relation to occupiers of land, the duty here arises out of the ability to control the property and knowledge as to the risk of damage to others because of something on the land. So the owner or occupier of that land is generally in the best position to control the risks. And it's also in the owner's interests because otherwise their land might be subject to kind of overly intrusive monitoring of their resources by others. So the case you would have discussed with Simon is Goldman and Hargrave. Is this ringing any bells? Anyone nodding? Goldman and Hargrave? Yep, excellent. So That involved the lightning strike that hit a tree on the defendant's land, and that tree caught fire and it wasn't put out, and the fire spread and damaged the neighbour's property. So, I don't know if Simon talked about this, but the whole idea of the Goldman duty is that it kind of sits in this no man's land between negligence and nuisance. And the reason for this is liability and nuisance is generally strict, but liability under the Goldman standard is fault-based. Liability and negligence is usually based on a failure to reach an objective standard of care, but under the Goldman standard, it is subjective. Okay, so it sits in this no man's land between between negligence and nuisance. What is reasonable for this occupier to have done, given their ability and their means? And sometimes it'll be enough to discharge the duty to invite the neighbour onto your land to say, hey, there's a fire roaring, feel free to come and put it out. So the owner occupies liability for a failure to act, so for a failure to put out a fire on their land, for example, arises by virtue of the responsibility an owner or occupier assumes as an incident to their ownership or occupation of land. Okay, it's a benefit and a privilege to own or occupy land. It gives you the right to exclude everyone else from it. But because of that, it brings with it certain obligations to make sure that land does not become an unreasonable source of danger to neighbours. And the two factors that are key to the imposition of a duty of care for an owner or occupier is that they control the land on which the hazard exists and they know of the hazard. Another example of a positive duty to confer a benefit is that of a bailee or a finder of goods or someone entrusted with looking after someone else's goods. They will have a duty to take reasonable steps to safeguard the goods of others from being destroyed or stolen or damaged. Other roles can include employer, employee. Okay, so employers have a responsibility to ensure employees are not physically injured at work and to look after staff if they feel ill or are injured. You can't behave like the priest from the parable and just walk on by. And, Barrington Ministry of Defence, as we discussed, involved a senior officer who stepped in, but likely if he hadn't stepped in to look after the person, he would have actually had a duty, the court would have found he had a duty to step in once Mr. Barrett was comatose. Child carers is another example. So schools owe the children in their care a duty to take reasonable steps to see a child is not physically injured on school premises. So, we're not going to spend much time on this exception. Now, the cases, except for Stansby and Troman, the cases essentially involve two parties, okay, where the defendant has omitted to confer a benefit on the plaintiff and the plaintiff has suffered harm. But the third special circumstance we're going to look at involves, it's often triggered when the immediate wrongdoer is a third party, but the defendant is sued for negligence. The defendant who is not the immediate wrongdoer, who hasn't caused the damage, and they are somehow held liable for the actions of that third party. Okay, so this third special circumstance, when the court will find that there is a duty of care on a defendant to confer a benefit on a claimant, is when the defendant is in a position of control over a cause of the danger and there is reasonable foreseeability of harm caused by that danger, and the plaintiff is at particular special risk. Okay, so why does control make a difference here? What is it about control that lets the court kind of say, this is something that we think should justify the duty of care, that shifts the dial from no duty to duty in relation to omissions? Now, There's actually not a straightforward answer to this. There are entire chapters written in books by extremely clever people that grapple with this very question. But one reason, and the reason that we will limit ourselves to, is that with acceptance of control comes responsibility. If you have control over a risk, you have a reliable ability to prevent it or to influence it in some way. Right, so the case that we're going to use here, and I know you will have discussed this case again already, is Home Office and Dorset Yacht. Have you discussed this with Joe? Yep, okay. Now, we'll just go through the facts again, but the part we'll be focusing on is how the duty was justified. So we've got a party of Borstal boys who are working on Brownsea Island in Poole Harbour under the supervision and control of 3 Borstal officers. Now, during the night, 7 of these boys escaped. Now, at the time of the escape, the 3 officers who are meant to be in charge of supervising these Borstal boys have all gone to bed in breach of their instructions, okay? And they've left these Borstal boys to their own devices. The escapees then boarded a yacht moored nearby, and they then set it in motion, and they caused it to collide with the plaintiff's yacht that was also moored in the vicinity. This yacht was then damaged by the collision and by the subsequent conduct of the Borstal escapees after they then boarded the claimant's yacht. So the question was, did the Home Office owe a duty of care to persons whose property would likely be damaged by the tortious acts of the Borstal trainees if they escaped, to prevent the escape of the Borstal trainees from custody? Here is a useful quote from Lord Diplock. Okay, so he says, "The branch of English law which deals with civil wrongs abounds with instances of acts, and more particularly of omissions which give rise to no legal liability in the doer or omitter for loss or damage sustained by others as a consequence of the act or omission, however reasonably or probably that loss or damage might have been anticipated." Okay? General rule, no liability for omissions. The very parable of the Good Samaritan, which was evoked by Lord Atkin and Donoghue and Stevenson, illustrates in the conduct of the priest and the Levite an omission which was likely to have as its reasonable and probable consequence damage to the health of the victim, but for which the priest and Levite would have incurred no civil liability in English law. Examples could be multiplied. Okay, you can cause loss to a tradesman by withdrawing your custom, even though the goods he supplies are entirely satisfactory. You may damage your neighbour's land by intercepting the flow of percolating water to it, even though that interception is of no advantage to yourself. You need not warn him of a risk of physical danger to which he is about to expose himself unless there is some special relationship between the two of you, such as occupier of land and visitor. You may watch your neighbour's goods being ruined by a thunderstorm, though the slightest effort on your part could protect them from the rain, and you may do so with impunity, unless there is some special relationship between you, such as that of Baylor and Bailey. Okay, so that's just a big illustration of the general rule. We do not have to act to confer benefits on others. We can cause loss by our omissions, and tort law won't come knocking. Okay, it's a really good judgment, this judgment of Lord Diplock's in this case. And he recognises, he says, look, we are in the realm of omissions here. And then he looks at cases which have marked, actually, I'm just going to switch this off so that, just for less distraction, okay? He looks at cases which have marked fresh developments in the law of negligence. Okay, so the first thing he recognises, he says, look, there was that neighbour relationship in Donoghue and Stevenson for positive acts causing physical damage. Okay, that's a landmark case. Okay, and then we moved on to Headley Burn. And here, the conduct was careless words, not careless deeds. In that case, the Donahue principle could have disposed of the claim, but the court recognised that the difference in the characteristics of the conduct in question, involving words, not acts, prevented Donahue from being directly applicable, and they created the new assumption of responsibility for negligent misstatements causing pure economic loss. Okay, and then he says, now we're looking at another new situation. Okay, we have got conduct of the defendant which is different from that invoked in Donahue and Stevenson, and it is different in two important respects. First, the actual damage that has been suffered by the plaintiff is the direct consequence of a tortious act done with conscious volition by a third party who is responsible in law for their own acts. Okay, so that's the first difference. There is the immediate wrongdoer is a third party responsible in law for their own acts. Second, there are two separate neighbour relationships involved. There is the relationship with the plaintiff whose property has been damaged, and there is a relationship with the third party who caused the damage. Now, he then looks at cases where a duty of care has been imposed on a defendant for damage caused by a third party. Okay, and he looks to see how far has the law already gone. Now, many of these cases involve damage caused, for instance, by one prisoner to another prisoner while they were in custody. But here, these Borstal boys had escaped custody. And he looks at, well, what were the characteristics that were present in those cases where liability has been found, which are absent in this case, and are those characteristics essential or not to a duty of care? Okay, this is all the legally significant features of duties of care. Is it essential? Is it or not? This is how this analogical reasoning works. So he reaches the conclusion that there are two critical relationships before there will be a duty of care. Question one, what is the critical characteristic of the relationship between the defendant and the immediate wrongdoer? Okay, that's the first question. Second question, what is the relationship between the defendant and the plaintiff? So let's look first at the relationship between the defendant and the immediate wrongdoer. What does this relationship require? Now, I'm sure that in terms of these slides, you would probably rather that I just said on it what that relationship requires, because it would be much easier. But if you have to write it down, it will stick, and that will save you time when you're studying, okay? There is a method to the madness, okay? So what does this relationship require between the defendant and the immediate wrongdoer? It needs to be one of control, okay? This is the key. Here, the Home Office had the legal right to detain the Borstal boys in custody and to control their acts while in custody. While they were not in fact in custody at the time of the wrongful act, the Home Office at that time still had the right and the legal responsibility to detain them in custody. Okay, even though they'd escaped, they hadn't been released, they had escaped. They were in control of the Home Office. They had the legal right and the legal responsibility to detain them in custody at that time. So control is really important in that relationship between the defendant and the immediate wrongdoer. Second question, what does the relationship between the defendant and the plaintiff who suffered damage by the act of the third party require before a duty of care will be owed? So they said, look, it's actually really common knowledge that borstal training often fails to achieve its purpose of reformation. Once released, trainees revert to a life of crime and may also cause tortious damage to the person and property of others. But so do criminals who have never been apprehended and criminals who have been released from custody because they have completed their sentence. Okay, so the risk of sustaining damage from the tortious acts of criminals is shared by the public at large. It has never been recognised at common law as giving rise to a cause of action against anyone except the criminal, him or herself. And he said, so it would seem very arbitrary and unjust to single out for the special privilege of being able to recover compensation from the authorities responsible for the prevention of crime, a person whose property was damaged by the tortious act of a criminal because the damage happened to be caused by a criminal who had escaped from custody before completion of their sentence, instead of it being caused by someone who had completed their sentence and been lawfully released. So they said the fact that it was caused because it escaped was not enough. There needed to be something more. What is that something more? To give rise to a duty on the part of a custodian, so the Home Office or the Corrections Department, we would call it in New Zealand, owed to a member of the public to take reasonable care to prevent a borstal trainee from escaping from his custody before the trainee's sentence is complete, there needed to be a relationship between the custodian and the person to whom the duty was owed that exposed that particular person to a particular risk of damage and consequence of their escape, which is different in its incidence from the general risk of damage he shares with all members of the public. Okay, and they noted that there were particular features of the relationship between the Home Office and the plaintiff yacht owner. What are some of these features? First, okay, the Home Office had adopted this particular kind of custodial system for young offenders, which was open air on an island, rather than inside four walls with a lock on the gate. Okay, now this particular form of, this particular system increased the risk of escape of the Borstal boys, unless due care was taken by those responsible for their supervision and custody. Second, these Borstal boys were known to escape and steal things and had done both these things before. Third, the only means of escape from this island would be to use a boat accessible from the shore of the island. Because of these things, the plaintiff, as the owner of a boat moored off the island, fell within the category of persons to whom a duty of care to prevent the escape of trainees was owed by the Home Office responsible for their custody. Okay, so they'd adopted this kind of open-air system of custody. They knew they'd escaped before, they'd stolen things before. The only way they could escape from this open-air island was if they stole a boat. Surprise, surprise, they did exactly that. Okay, this put the plaintiff in a position of suffering a particular risk of damage. Now, they also noted that what distinguishes a Borstal trainee who has escaped from an island, from one who's been duly released from custody, is their liability to recapture. Okay, so the fact that they had escaped was relevant. And when someone is liable to recapture, there is this added risk that, they will be trying to elude pursuit immediately upon discovery of their escape. So they might steal or appropriate property that helps them get as far away as possible. So what this is getting at is that if the boys had been released near some boats on the mainland, and then they'd happened to steal, if they'd been lawfully released beside some boats and they happened to steal a boat, there wouldn't be that duty of care. But because they have escaped from an island, they're trying to elude recapture, right? So they are getting as far away as possible, as quickly as they can, and that involves stealing a boat to help them on their journey. And it makes it reasonably foreseeable that boats in the immediate vicinity would be stolen or captured in the course of eluding recapture. It would be different if they were lawfully released near some boats. It's not immediately foreseeable that they will steal boats just because they're there. They could just walk, catch a bus, whatever. Okay. But they said, look, the Home Office are not going to be liable for every single crime committed by these boys after they escape. There is going to be a boundary point to their liability. So if the boys sailed successfully to the mainland and then they stole a car to continue their escape, would the Home Office be liable to the owner of the car? Don't know. I think maybe less likely, okay? There's not the same proximity. Using a car is not the only means of transport once you're on the mainland. They could walk. They could catch some public transport perhaps, I don't know. But when you're on an island trying to escape, the only way you can escape is by using a boat in the near vicinity. So that created the specific relationship between the Home Office and the plaintiff whose boat was damaged. So the critical point is that the owner of the yacht is property situated in the vicinity of the place of detention of escape, was in a special position as compared to the risk, or the owner of the boat was in a special position as compared to every other person or member of the public at risk of suffering damage at the hands of escaped Borstal boys. And it was this special position that justified the imposition of a duty of care. We're going to see this idea of special risk come up again when we talk about couch and public body liability, which is a New Zealand case. Does anyone have any questions about Home Office in Dorset? No. Okay, so... Oh, here we are. There's another slide. Okay, so what we've covered today then is this question of what are the circumstances, what are the special... Sorry, I don't know why this is ringing. What are the special circumstances when a court will recognise a duty of care for an omission? Okay, one is when the defendant has assumed responsibility by taking on a task for the claimant's welfare. One is the defendant's status as holding a position of responsibility. And the one we've just discussed is when the defendant is in a position of control over the cause of the danger and there is reasonable foreseeability of harm caused by that danger and there is a particular risk of harm to the particular claimant. Okay, so what we will move on to tomorrow is the second part that is highlighted, where we are liable for dangers we have created, including dangers resulting from human agency where it's foreseeable that third parties may spark them off. Sorry, I don't know why that's ringing. Something louder. It's just extreme. was also the fact that they were on an island, so they had to use a boat to get away, and also the fact that they were escaping meant that they would use something to get them away quickly. So it was those kind of two.
So basically, it was very foreseeable that it would stop.
Yeah. Well, yes, it was very foreseeable, and because they had control, because they were special respect created the proximity. It's all about the kind of why is there proximity here in a way that there wouldn't have been to the owner of the car on the main road. Like what distinguishes these features? Yeah, exactly.
But listen to your client, shouldn't they also like, do they also have some kind of contributory negligence as well? Because they should have opted like better if they knew that like there was like a prison facility nearby and they could have escaped.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? To what extent are we required to? I don't know that there is that kind of contributory negligence. I mean, I don't know what they knew about it.
But like, yeah, I kind of understand why. So it's
Yeah.
just because that they have to escape and they escape before they stop things before. So
Yeah.
it's kind of reasonable to proceed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just grab my things and. Yeah, we could meet out here if you want. I can just do it quick. Would you rather do that? Just yeah. Should we go out here and then I'll save you wandering down?